On an ordinary night in a forgotten bar near the naval base, a single confrontation will expose a truth the United States military buried for more than 5 decades, a truth so heavy that when it finally rises, every man in that room will understand. They almost provoked a legend no living database has ever dared to record. What begins as a simple seat dispute will unravel into the most dangerous revelation the Navy has kept hidden since the 1960s. The rusty anchor breathed with dim neon light and the sour scent of stale beer, a place where young sailors bragged loudly and old veterans drank quietly. In the darkest corner sat Mark Douglas, a 72-year-old man in a faded red shirt and a canvas jacket smelling faintly of rain and smoke, his hands steady around a small glass of whiskey that he lifted with ritual calm. His posture was not frailty, it was the stillness of someone who learned long ago how to watch without being seen. The door burst open, and Lieutenant Jax Miller strode in with 4 young Navy Special Operations members behind him, fresh from a successful mission and swollen with the dangerous confidence of men who believed the world already belonged to them. They spotted the corner booth and marched toward it as if claiming territory. Miller leaned over Mark, voice sharp enough to slice the silence, asking if the old-timer could hear him, or if his hearing aid was off. Mark did not look up, choosing instead to savor the burn of cheap whiskey, before answering with calm gravel in his voice that he was fine where he Saturday. The group laughed, mocking his age, his clothing, even his worth, insisting the booth was only for active duty and pushing him toward the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall down the road. Sully, the bartender, attempted to intervene, but the young lieutenant dismissed him instantly, declaring the moment Navy business. The mood of the bar shifted as insults grew sharper, Miller's hands slamming on the table while Davis sneered about Mark peeling potatoes in 1975. Mark simply placed a $10 bill on the wood, choosing dignity over conflict, and began to rise from the booth. But Miller stepped in front of him, blocking his exit with the arrogance of someone who had never been corrected by consequences. Miller demanded one answer before letting Mark leave. He wanted to know the old man's call sign, the name that proved a warrior's worth. He bragged about his own call sign, Viper, and pointed at his squad member Sledge, mocking Mark with childish cruelty and insisting he must have been nothing more than a clerk. Only then did Mark finally lift his eyes, revealing a depth so cold and so ancient that even the laughter in the room seemed to hesitate. "You do not want to know," Mark said softly. But Miller leaned closer, grinning, believing he had cornered a harmless senior citizen and unaware that he was brushing against a history soaked in shadows. And viewers, stay until the final moment of this story, because when the truth of that call sign is finally spoken, it will hit harder than anything the Navy has ever admitted. For one brief heartbeat, the bar stood suspended between mockery and something far darker. And then the world inside Mark Douglas's mind shifted. The neon lights, the stale beer, the laughter of boys who thought they were wolves, all of it dissolved in an instant, replaced by the suffocating heat of a jungle that had swallowed entire battalions whole. In that sudden memory, the air was thick enough to taste, heavy with rot, gun oil, and the metallic scent of waiting death. Mark was young again, no older than 22, his face smeared with mud that had dried and cracked like old paint. For 3 days, he had moved alone behind enemy lines with no radio support, no extraction plan, and no guarantee that he would ever see the sky again. Every footstep was a blade's edge, every exhale a gamble, and every shadow a possible execution. And yet he moved with a silence so complete that even the jungle seemed afraid to whisper his presence. A voice crackled through his memory, warped by static but unmistakable in tone. "We have no assets in the area. You are on your own, Reaper." The call sign struck the air like a bell tolling at the gates of death, not a nickname, but a warning for anyone on the receiving end. The enemy had their own word for him too, a word spoken in terror during the darkest hours when they believed ghosts walked among them. The vision snapped like a rubber band, pulling Mark back into the dim bar where Lieutenant Miller still stood smirking, convinced of his own invincibility. Mark blinked once as the jungle retreated from his gaze, leaving behind a faint, chilling stillness that did not belong to any ordinary man. That was when Sully, behind the bar, noticed something that froze the blood in his veins, the brief rise of Mark's sleeve revealing a circular burn scar on his wrist, precise and unmistakable. Sully's breath caught. He had heard stories of that mark whispered in non-commissioned officer clubs. Cautious tales told only when the doors were locked and the whiskey was strong. The mark belonged to men whose missions were erased, whose units were never listed, and whose existence was denied even to the Central Intelligence Agency. They were the ghosts of the Cold War, the instruments used when official channels refused to get their hands dirty. Sully backed away from the counter, each step slower than the last, as if he feared waking a sleeping predator. He moved toward the office, heart pounding, knowing exactly what the old bartender before him had warned. If the man with the circle brand returns, you call the number inside the safe, and you do not question why. Inside the office, Sully's hands trembled as he dialed the long sequence written on that fading scrap of paper. The line clicked, and a cold, authoritative voice answered. "Who is this?" "This is Sully at the Rusty Anchor," he whispered, glancing through the office window at the confrontation building by the second. I think he is here." "Who is here?" "The Reaper," Sully said, barely able to force the word out. "The man with the circle brand. And there is a group of young Navy frogmen pushing him. It is about to get very bad." A silence followed, deep, absolute, terrifying, the kind of silence that comes only when the past finally catches up. Then the voice returned, colder than a winter river. "Do not let them touch him. Do not let them disrespect him. I am 3 minutes away. Keep the peace, Sully, or may God help all of you." Back in the bar, the air felt charged, the laughter fading into an uneasy awareness that something ancient was about to awaken. Miller had no idea what he had just provoked, no idea how close his hand was to a fire hot enough to burn through entire histories. And viewers, stay with this story until the very end, because when the man on the other end of that phone walks through the door, everything you think you know about military legends will shift forever. When Sully hung up the phone, his pulse felt like it was trying to break free from his ribs. He wiped his palms on his apron, but the sweat only returned, heavier, colder, as if his body understood a truth his mind was still racing to catch. 3 minutes. That was all the time he had before someone far above his pay grade walked through that door, someone who knew exactly what the return of a man like Mark Douglas meant. Out in the bar, those 3 minutes were already collapsing. Lieutenant Jax Miller, drunk on pride rather than alcohol, stepped closer to Mark, his face twisting with irritation at the old man's refusal to bow. He poked a finger into Mark's chest, declaring loudly that as a commissioned officer, he was giving a direct order to identify himself and vacate the booth immediately. None of the young operators noticed how the entire bar had fallen silent, the room holding its breath as if the walls themselves feared the next move. Mark rose from the booth with slow, deliberate precision, his knees cracking softly but his posture straightening into something impossibly steady. Though he stood only 5 feet 9 inches, the moment he faced Miller, he seemed to grow taller, as if the air around him shifted in recognition of something older than rank. His gray eyes locked on the lieutenant, and the faint ripple of annoyance from earlier returned, sharpened now into a warning. "I was serving this country before your father was a glint in the milkman's eye," Mark said, voice low but carrying the weight of decades. "I have earned my seat. Now move." The words hit Miller harder than a punch. His face flushed, beet red, pride twisting into anger. Instead of stepping back, he stepped forward and shoved Mark's shoulder, a small shove, a stupid shove, but enough to rip open the thin barrier that had kept everything contained. The moment Miller's hand touched Mark, the atmosphere in the bar cracked like glass under pressure. Mark did not stumble. He did not even sway. He simply looked down at the place where Miller had shoved him, then lifted his eyes with a calm so chilling that several nearby patrons unconsciously edged backward. It was the kind of calm that belonged to men who survived places others did not return from. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly how far a threat could go before it became a mistake. "That was a mistake," Mark whispered. Sully burst from behind the bar, vaulting the counter in a single motion that shocked even the young operators. He planted himself between the two men with a force that made bottles rattle on the shelves. "Lieutenant, stand down," he barked, voice cracking with urgency. "That is a direct order from the owner. Stand down right now." Miller spun on him, furious. "Shut up, Sully. This civilian—" "He's not a civilian, you idiot," Sully roared, louder than the jukebox, louder than the room's collective panic. "You have no idea who you are touching." Miller shoved Sully aside, the last remnants of restraint burning away. He grabbed Mark by the collar, gripping tightly with the intention of dragging the old man outside in front of everyone. The young operators grinned, expecting a humiliating scene, blind to the fact that they were seconds from witnessing a disaster their training had not prepared them for. And then the bar door exploded open with such violent force that every head snapped toward it. The heavy wooden door slammed against the wall with the explosive crack of a rifle shot. Conversations died mid-breath. Bottles stopped clinking. Even the hum of the neon sign seemed to choke into silence. Standing in the doorway was a figure every man in that room instantly recognized, a figure whose very presence bent the atmosphere into submission. And viewers, stay until the final moments of this story, because the man who just entered the room will reveal a truth so shocking that everything you have heard so far will feel like only the quiet before the storm. The door had not simply opened, it had detonated. The wooden slab smashed against the wall with the concussive force of an explosion, and in that frozen second, every arrogant grin in the room melted into panic. Lieutenant Jax Miller's hand remained twisted in Mark's collar, but now it trembled, unsure, as the shape in the doorway stepped forward with the controlled precision of a man used to commanding storms. Admiral David Vance entered the rusty anchor, wearing a dress blue uniform so immaculate it seemed to pull the entire room into alignment. Rows of ribbons glinted across his chest, nearly reaching his shoulder, the accumulated weight of decades of service and sacrifice. Two men in dark suits followed behind him, their posture radiating cold readiness, hands hovering near earpieces as if expecting chaos. Every young sailor in the room snapped to attention with such frantic desperation that several nearly tripped over their own feet. Beer bottles toppled, chairs scraped across the floor. The confidence that had filled the room like smoke vanished, replaced by raw fear. Lieutenant Miller's spine straightened so sharply that it made an audible pop. "Admiral on deck," Miller shouted, voice cracking like a teenager's. But Admiral Vance did not acknowledge him, not even with a glance. His eyes, stern, unblinking, focused, were locked entirely on the old man at the center of the confrontation. He walked past the young special operations team as if they were coats on a rack, brushing Miller's shoulder without slowing down. His steps echoed through the silent bar, each one striking like a drumbeat in a funeral march. He stopped 3 feet from Mark Douglas. The Admiral's face was carved from stone, yet something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of shock, recognition, and emotion. So profound it cracked the mask he had worn for a lifetime. He lifted his hand sharply, palm turned perfectly vertical, fingers aligned with military exactness. It was not the salute of rank to rank. It was not protocol. It was reverence. He held the salute for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, a gesture from a man who had saluted presidents, generals, and war heroes, yet none with this depth of respect. Mark's lips lifted into the faintest crooked smile. Slowly, almost casually, he raised his own hand and returned the salute with the kind of effortless muscle memory that never dies, even after decades of silence. When their hands lowered, the room seemed to exhale. "At ease, David," Mark said softly. The Admiral released a breath he might have been holding for years. "It has been a long time, Master Chief," he replied, voice roughened with emotion. "We thought you were dead. We lost you after Panama." Mark eased back into the booth as if this were a conversation between old friends rather than the shattering of military hierarchy. "I like being dead," he said. "It is quieter." The shock only deepened on the faces of the young operators. Master Chief, Panama. A salute from an admiral. None of it made sense. The world, they understood the world of rank, order, and visible power had just tilted beneath their feet. Admiral Vance turned slowly, and the warmth drained from his expression like someone flipping a switch. His eyes locked onto Lieutenant Miller with a cold fury that made the earlier tension feel like a childish spat. Miller's throat bobbed as he swallowed, sweat crawling down his temple. "Lieutenant," Vance said, his voice low enough to quiet storms. "Sir?" Miller croaked. "Do you know who this man is?" "No, sir. He refused to identify himself, sir. He was occupying a booth reserved for active duty personnel." Vance stepped closer, towering over the lieutenant, his voice rising enough for the entire bar to hear. "This man is Mark Douglas. His file is sealed so deeply that it has been black since 1968. He is not listed on any roster. He is not recorded in any database. He is a myth to most, and the reason others lived to tell their stories." Miller paled. The bar watched, breathless, waiting for the next blow, not from fists, but from truth. Admiral Vance kept his gaze locked on Lieutenant Miller, and the younger man seemed to shrink with every syllable that followed. "When I was a brand new ensign in the Mekong Delta," Vance said, his voice rising just enough for the entire room to hear, "my patrol boat was ambushed. We were caught in a kill box. Heavy fire from 3 directions. Men screaming. We were sinking under the weight of bullets and river mud." The Admiral took 1 slow step closer to Miller, his eyes never blinking. "We called for air support. Weather refused us. We called for extraction. They said the zone was too hot. We were already dead men moving." The young operators stood frozen, barely breathing, as Vance relived a memory that had clearly never left him. And then, the Admiral continued, a single silhouette stepped out of the tree line. One man, no squad, no helicopter, no backup, just a rifle in one hand, a knife in the other, and a willingness to walk straight into hell without flinching. His voice hardened. In under 4 minutes, that man silenced 3 machine gun nests, pulled me and 6 of my crew from the river, and dragged us for 3 miles through a swamp with a bullet lodged in his leg. Vance pointed directly at Mark. That man never gave us his name. We never heard his voice. When we asked for a call sign, he looked at us once, then disappeared back into the jungle. A beat of silence hung in the air before Vance added, "We later learned the enemy had a name for him. They called him the Reaper." The color drained from Miller's cheeks as he stared at the old man he had mocked minutes earlier. The red shirt, the canvas jacket, the $10 bill. None of it matched the legend being revealed before him. His knees seemed to soften, his jaw trembling as realization sank talon deep into his pride. Vance advanced until he was inches from Miller. "You wanted his call sign, Lieutenant. You demanded it as if it were something owed to you. You insulted a man who earned his trident before the program even existed. You tried to push out the person whose doctrine you are still attempting to memorize." Then, with the precision of a blade, Vance reached up and ripped the unit patch from Miller's shoulder. The Velcro tore with a sound that echoed like punishment. "You are a disgrace to the uniform," Vance said, voice thunderous now, filling the bar with fury and disappointment. "You and your squad are confined to quarters immediately. Tomorrow morning, you will face a board of inquiry, and I will personally ensure your command is removed. Be grateful he did not handle you himself." Miller staggered backward, eyes shining with the sting of humiliation. His squad, once so full of grins and bravado, looked at the floor, terrified to meet the Admiral's gaze. None dared defend the lieutenant. None dared speak. They moved toward the exit in a tangled scramble, tripping over chairs, knocking bottles aside in their desperation to escape. The heavy door swung shut behind them with a dull thud, the sound of careers collapsing. When silence settled, Vance turned back to Mark, and his anger melted away, replaced by something filled with old sorrow and deeper respect. "I apologize, Mark. I should have taught them better. Standards are slipping." Mark exhaled, the calm of a man who had seen storms far greater than this one. "They are young, David, full of fire and vinegar. They have not been burned yet. Let time and the ocean teach them what pride cannot." Vance nodded slowly, as if absorbing a lesson he had forgotten along the way. "Can I buy you a drink, Reaper? For old time's sake?" Mark rose from the booth, joints cracking softly, yet movements still controlled. "No, I've had enough noise for one night. I only wanted a quiet drink." He reached for his jacket, suddenly small again. Suddenly just an elderly man ready to go home, but no one in that room would ever see him as ordinary again. As he walked toward the door, patrons instinctively stood, forming a jagged path of respect, not out of command, but out of something deeper they could not name. And just before Mark reached the night air, the energy in the bar shifted again because something else, something not yet revealed, was still waiting to surface. Mark paused beneath the doorway as the night breeze rolled into the bar, carrying with it the scent of ocean salt and cold asphalt, a reminder of the world outside, quiet, indifferent, and far safer than the room he had just left. Behind him, a strange reverence filled the dim tavern. Bikers, sailors, mechanics, and locals who had come only for a drink now stood in a crooked, uneven formation that felt more sacred than any military ceremony. No one spoke. No one dared try. Respect, not demanded, not ordered, but earned, hung in the air like incense. Mark glanced over his shoulder one last time. "David?" he said softly. "Yes, Mark. Tell the bartender. The kid paid for my drink. I left $10, but his ego owes the rest." A faint smile touched his lips, then disappeared just as quickly. With that, he stepped into the cool darkness beyond the door, letting it close behind him as gently as a man closing the final chapter of his life. Inside, Admiral Vance stood motionless, watching the empty doorway as if he were watching a ghost fade into fog. Then he walked toward the booth where Mark had Saturday. He picked up the empty shot glass and held it to the dim light, studying the ring of water drying on the table's scarred wood. For a moment, the Admiral looked as though he were staring at a memorial, not a table. "Nobody sits here tonight," Vance said quietly. "This table stays empty." The bar murmured in agreement. Not a single soul objected. Sully released a breath he had been holding so long, his ribs ached. He approached Vance with the careful steps of a man still processing what he had witnessed. Before he could speak, the Admiral cut in. "Sully, I hope you understand the weight of what just passed through this room. Sully nodded slowly. I saw the scar, Admiral. I knew the stories. Vance placed the glass down with reverence. Believe the stories, he said. Every single one. The lights flickered for just a second, and for reasons none could explain, the murmur in the bar faded once more into a silence thick enough to feel. A silence that stirred something deep inside Mark's history, a memory rising like a storm breaking through clouds. Suddenly, the bar dissolved in Mark's mind. It was 1969 again. Rain hammered the jungles of Vietnam with the violence of machine gun fire. Mark, 22 years old, lay motionless in mud that clung to his skin like cold tar. Leeches crawled across his arms, but he did not move, not even to blink. Down below in the dark valley, an enemy camp held American prisoners awaiting execution. He checked his battered wristwatch. He checked his knife. Then, with 2 fingers, he touched a circular burn on his wrist, a self-made mark, a promise of the life and death circle he had chosen to walk. He rose from the mud as though the earth itself released him. He did not run. He flowed. The first guard died without a sound. The second glimpsed a silhouette but saw only a shadow shaped like fear. In the darkness, a whisper drifted through the leaves, soft enough to be lost in the rain. Home. And just like that, the flashback vanished, swallowed by the present as patrons stared at the empty seat where Mark had been moments before. The bar felt different now. Not haunted, but hallowed, like a place where something sacred had been revealed and could never be forgotten. In the following days, the story spread across the naval base with the speed of wildfire, carried in whispers, never in official reports. Lieutenant Miller disappeared quietly into a remote desk assignment far north, while his squad endured a brutal retraining regimen focused not on tactics, but on humility. Sully received a small package 7 days later, no return address. Inside was a bottle of old, expensive whiskey and a single note written in an unsteady hand. Keep the table open. The legend of the Reaper had returned for one night. He would not return again. Time passed, but the atmosphere inside the rusty anchor never fully returned to what it had been before that night. Patrons spoke in quieter tones. Sailors treated the corner booth like sacred ground. Even the neon signs seemed to buzz a little softer, as though they too remembered the stillness that had filled the room when Mark Douglas stood. No plaque was hung, no photograph was taken, and no official mention appeared anywhere on the base. Yet everyone knew a ghost had returned and vanished again. Far from the bar, on the edge of a small town, stood a modest, one-story house painted in weathered white. The lawn was uneven, the fence old, the porch slightly crooked. At dawn, when the world shifted from darkness to pale gold, Mark sat there with a cup of coffee in hand. His fingers were steady, the same steadiness that unsettled an entire room of trained warriors. His eyes were clear, reflecting the sunrise with the quiet patience of a man who had outrun war, age, time, and memory. To his neighbors, he was simply Mark, the polite old man who nodded while collecting mail or trimming hedges. No one asked about his past. No one knew how many times he had disappeared into jungles, or how many sleepless nights he had carried other men's lives in his hands. They did not know about the missions without radio support, the dossiers without names, the operations that vanished into the dark before anyone could record them. And Mark preferred it that way. Inside the naval base, however, the story would not die. It grew into a quiet legend, whispered in gyms, barracks, and break rooms. Some dismissed it as exaggerated. Others insisted they had seen the Admiral's face that night, had seen how even the highest ranks bowed their heads. A few young sailors found excuses to stop by the rusty anchor, simply to stare at the empty booth, as if hoping the man in the red shirt might materialize out of the shadows again. But he never did. He had returned only long enough to remind the new generation of something the modern world often forgets. The most dangerous individuals are rarely the ones who brag, boast, or perform. They are the ones who carry their history in silence, their scars hidden beneath sleeves, their truths locked behind eyes that have seen more than any uniform can display. The Reaper lived quietly now, not as a specter of war, but as a man reclaiming the years stolen from him. He watched the sunrise. He fed birds in the yard. He repaired the same creaking step on the porch every few weeks. And though his life appeared simple, the quiet he held inside him was the kind of quiet forged only in the darkest corners of human conflict. Somewhere far away, in a secure office filled with files no one was allowed to open, a black dossier marked with no name gathered dust, and somewhere in the minds of the few who had once served beside him His memory flickered like a warning, a reminder that some truths must remain buried, and some legends must remain ghosts. But that night at the Rusty Anchor had proven one thing: even ghosts can return when pushed. And for those who were there, the silence he left behind was louder than any shout, any threat, or any battlefield roar they had ever known.